What are the downsides of weed that people don't talk about? I can't imagine this will get seen now. However, I'm going to comment because I rarely ever do. I am in my mid-20s studying to be a professional pilot, and have smoked habitually several times a day for the last several years. While I am still a large advocate for marijuana, I stopped smoking entirely about a month ago because I realized a few things. 1. I became complacent with my life and my surroundings, rarely wanting to make a change in my routine because I knew when I able to spark up. 2. I would spend extra cash on edibles, concentrates, weed, etc. Essentially having extra spending money meant it was going to get me high. 3. I felt as if I would make excuses to not see friends and family, so that I would ensure that I would be comfortable and at home with my shit in hand. 4. It becomes a nightly ritual, to the point where going to sleep without it sounded impossible. 5. Following number 4. You stop dreaming, due to the fact that THC hinders REM sleep. I never really understood this until I quit and started having incredibly memorable and vivid dreams. With all that said, I still believe it's a beautiful plant that has wonderful benefits. But, if you're at the point where you think that you can't live without it, I need you to know that nothing is healthy in excessive amounts. Both my roommates are heavy smokers, and they just think so slowly. It takes them forever to understand anything. They also forget a lot of stuff, like they'll step away from the dishes for a moment and then never finish them without prompting. The house smells like a coffin. I eat the occasional edible, but seeing how lethargic they are has convinced me to quit smoking pot entirely. It can overcorrect for anxiety and cause more anxiety. It can dull emotions in general. This can be good or bad. When you need to be empathetic or aware, you are less likely to be. It dulls focus. You can power through it and make that focus reappear if needed, but it's an uphill battle to get to that point, and if you lose focus again you gotta rebuild it. Lowers short-term memory, which leads to less long-term memories, especially of details. It can interfere with sex drive in men. This has been studied and known. Not all men, but some. It can cause stomach pain in some people. It is mentally addictive, and hijacks the dopamine system. This can be reversed by not smoking, but it can make pleasures less pleasurable if you smoke heavily for a long term. After about 10 years of use, my body has developed an allergy that I have never heard anyone else get. When I use THC, my sinus gets inflamed, nearly blocking the airway, forcing me to breathe through my mouth, making falling asleep very difficult. Also, the next morning the boogers I get are relentless. It is like all the stuff is coming back out my sinus. This almost always ends up with minor bleeding nose. It seems like most of my response has already been said, but I want to reiterate 3 major observations what I've noticed from my own semi-frequently weed consumption. Demotivation. The impact from weed on motivation levels I find is in 2 parts. The first part is when you initially consume the weed, most people fall into a habit of eating food and watching something on TV. The second part I found is the next morning, I experience a type of weed hangover the following morning. I feel more groggy and more susceptible to just loading around the following day. Anxiety. Things that aren't currently stressing you out may start to induce anxiety in you. While this isn't always the case, weed has the potential to worsen your mental state if you aren't careful. This impact became more pronounced when I smoked weed solo. Having other people around allowed me to be more present in the moment, whereas I was in my head when I was alone. Food consumption. I found for me that continued weed use led to some unhealthy eating habits. The munchies are real, and for often that not you are craving food that is not considered healthy. If this becomes a more common occurrence, then your overall diet can go south quickly. One thing that I never see brought up is the effect of marijuana on dreaming. Marijuana use can prevent the user from dreaming during regular sleep. When the user stops using marijuana for a while, they can experience night after night of extremely vivid dreams. I can only speak from my own experience, but I have heard this echoed by a co-worker's dad who started smoking again because he couldn't handle having acid trip dreams every night. I suspect that marijuana has some potent effect on REM sleep that will remain underdocumented until it is descheduled and more thorough research can be done. I would say that as a long-term smoker that wants out, it has made me incredibly boring. If I have evening plans on the weekend but smoke anything in the day, then I'm far more prone to canceling those nighttime plans. If I do attend those plans after smoking in the day, then I feel I'm not entirely there. Awkward silences, jokes don't land. Keeping a conversation going becomes 10x harder, and I'm inevitably just waiting for an appropriate time to leave. Overall, it just kinda makes you socially awkward and super boring to be around in a social setting. Just from my experience. I smoked every day for about 10 years. minus about 6 months in all that is I needed to be clean for a drug test for a job. Emo weed starts off amazing and fun, but after becoming a habitual smoker it turns into a crux that's hard to shake. It's not that it's super addicting, it's just nothing is as fun as being high, so you want to be high all the time. It dulls feelings but highlights feelings of existentialism which can sometimes be overbearing. I would also feel stuck in my life a lot, like it would be hard to make changes, but I would want better things for myself, but it always seemed impossible to achieve. I did have problems with breathing, but I have a history of asthma and took up Tai Chi to compensate, which I found really enjoyable, and it helped me to slow down greatly on smoking. The one most annoying thing with being a smoker is your tolerance level goes way up, so even though you are smoking you aren't getting that high you used to get, just a mind-numbing insomnia almost. I also had a loss of appetite over time and ate less. It also made me feel comfortable with where I was in life, and I had a lack of motivation, though some days like once a month or two it could really motivate you to do something, but that would wither away quickly. Overall I would recommend it only at parties or every once in a while, but I have quit a while ago and never want to go back to being a daily smoker. Also, me being an expectant mother now has changed my feelings towards it. I don't want my kids growing up around it or around me being high. I feel they should find that on their own if they want, and I shouldn't influence them to think it's okay. Frequent heavy use can affect your motivation and mood, even during periods of not being high. It is habit forming. Not technically addictive, but for some it can be habit forming in maladaptive ways. Bad for your lungs if you inhale combusted flour. It can trigger psychosis if you're susceptible to it already. Like anything else in the world, it can be addictive. Putting anything that's not air in your lungs is bad for you. One of the biggest downsides I've seen as someone that doesn't smoke but who had many friends that do, is it becomes an obsession or crutch. What I mean by this? Most of my friends can't get through the day without smoking pot. They constantly need it for stress or irritation. And by doing this it becomes an obsession. For many, including people I've dated, is all they care about doing. Going to their bestie's house and smoking pot. That's literally it. I'm not saying this end up being everyone. But it is many. Brain Structure and Function, a systematic review of 56 published neuroimaging studies of brain structure and function in adult cannabis users found consistent evidence of reduced hippocampal volume and lower hippocampal gray matter density in cannabis users relative to controls, and no evidence for changes in whole brain volume. Evidence for changes in other brain regions was inconsistent or inconclusive. 1. Findings for other brain regions were inconsistent or inconclusive. Abnormalities of neuronal activity were observed even when cognitive task performance was normal, suggesting that cannabis users may need to engage different levels of neuronal activation to achieve normal performance. The hippocampus, among other things, is primarily responsible for memory. Habitual marijuana use changes neuron activity, requiring the brain to adapt to perform normal tasks. It's unclear if these adaptations come at a cost, but it's worth noting that brain function changes. Cannabis-induced psychosis, a national registry study that identified 1,492 patients who received a diagnosis of cannabis-induced psychosis in the Danish Psychiatric Central Research Register between 1994 and 2014 and followed them through August 2014, found a 41.2%, 95% C 36.6 to 46.2, conversion rate to schizophrenia, with 50% of men converting within 2.0 years and 50% of women within 4.4 years. 2. There is a significant hazard of developing schizophrenia for those with underlying family history of the disease, especially during adolescence. Mood disorders. Depression. A 2014 meta-analysis of 14 prospective longitudinal studies that controlled for depression at baseline found that heavy cannabis users had a 1.62 odds ratio, 95% C 1.21 to 2.16, for developing clinically diagnosed major depression or depressive symptoms, compared with light or non-users. 3. Bipolar disorder. A meta-analysis of 2 studies of individuals with bipolar disorder found cannabis use associated with a 3-fold increased risk. Odds ratio equals 2.97, 95% C 1.80 to 4.90, for new onset of manic symptoms. 4. Heavy marijuana use is associated with an increased risk of developing major depressive disorder. Struck rather than removed for transparency, I misinterpreted the study. Odds ratio does not imply that heavy marijuana use increases risk of depression, and marijuana is associated with those with bipolar disorder being several times more likely to develop mania. The list goes on to include anxiety disorders, lung problems, which should make sense when thinking of inhaling any kind of smoke or vaping fluid, cancer risks, cyclic vomiting syndrome, decreased male fertility, Increased risk of tooth/gum disease. Marijuana won't kill you as fast as some other drugs/alcohol/other vices, but that's a far cry from calling it safe. There are likely ways to mitigate some of these risks, like reducing lung problems through use of edibles, but many of these complications from marijuana use stem from the cannabinoids in the system rather than the route of use. This also doesn't touch on the potential benefits of CBD, THC, etc. It's important to remember that when talking about any medicine that there are risks and benefits associated. For example, aspirin can save your life in a heart attack but can cause stomach bleeding, so we give aspirin shortly after heart attack symptoms start, but we don't recommend taking aspirin daily. Unless we do, because other factors complicate the picture. Medicine is complicated that way. Parts of marijuana may make for good medicine once it's further studied and the good things isolated, but it's extremely important to remember that being medicinal absolutely does not make it harmless in any way, shape or form.